Thank you everyone for coming on today, and welcome to today's Rising Voices online event. We're really excited to be here with you, and I'm Julie Maldonado, and together with Heather Lazarus, we serve as the co-directors of the Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Sciences, and we're very thrilled to welcome everyone to the special online event today, Building Relational and Effective Partnerships with Indigenous Communities, with James Rattling and Gwen Bridge. And so just a little background on Rising Voices for folks new to the space. The Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Sciences is housed within the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is in turn managed by the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. And we acknowledge that NCAR is in the traditional territory of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. And as many of you know, the Rising Voices Center facilitates intercultural, relational-based approaches for understanding and adapting to extreme weather and climate events, to climate variability and climate change. And the center brings Indigenous and other scientific professionals, tribal and community leaders, environmental and communication experts, students, educators, artists from across the United States, including Alaska, Hawaii, the Pacific and Caribbean islands, and around the world, to really assess critical community needs and pursue joint research aimed at developing optimal plans for community action towards sustainability and regeneration. And Rising Voices acknowledges the inherent value of Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous science, adaptive practices, wisdom, and processes, and honoring these alongside with earth sciences. And at its core, Rising Voices aims to advance science through collaborations that bring Indigenous and Earth, including atmospheric, social, biological, ecological sciences into partnership, supports adaptive and resilient communities through sharing scientific capacity, and provides opportunities for Indigenous students and early career scientists through scientific and community mentoring. And it's, Nate, if you can go to the next slide. Our very heartfelt gratitude to the Rising Voices Steering Committee, to our council, funders, who are the committee and funders represented on this slide, and many more in the community who make this program and process really possible and make Rising Voices what it is, together with all of you. So thank you everyone for being here and being part of it. Next slide, Reed. So throughout today's event, we ask that you respect and honor the Rising Voices ethics guidelines. The guidelines provide a starting point and considerations for good practices when working in intercultural spaces. These guidelines include valuing a diversity of views and opinions, speak without judgment or argument, to share the air. We all have something to learn and something to share. Be considerate, respectful, and collaborative in speaking and listening. Please respect the diversity of knowledges articulated at Rising Voices. To please respect the good practices for intercultural collaborations. One such example, and we'll provide the link here, is the Research Ethics, a source guide to conducting research with Indigenous peoples. That knowledge shared at any Rising Voices activity should only be used if collaborators follow the full process of collaboration. To be respectful and aware of diverse experiences and histories, as current relationships and collaborations are very much shaped by settler colonial histories. And please do not appropriate or plagiarize knowledge shared during Rising Voices or future collaborations. And I'm going to put in to the chat, hopefully folks can see this. I can get this over to everyone, that this is the link to the Rising Voices ethics guidelines that we welcome you all to visit. And if we can go to the next slide, Reed. Thank you. And also, along with the ethics guidelines, Rising Voices holds the following values, which we work to uphold here: in working to remove the boundaries between science and society, to grow a network of collaborators with diverse cultural, community, geographic, and educational backgrounds, to include a diversity of views and opinions, including acknowledging the inherent value of Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous science, adaptive practices and processes, and to advocate relational-based as opposed to extractive or transactional-based science. We ask that you listen, learn, and share between and across cultures and generations, to prioritize relationship building and developing trust over time. And last but very much not least, to respect and awareness of diverse experiences and histories, again, as current relationships and collaborations are shaped by colonial histories. And I'm going to now, following the guidelines, I'm going to add to the chat. The Rising Voices values can be found at the link I provided. And thank you. I know there's some notices coming my way that folks have been trying to get into the Zoom room. Reed is working on resolving that issue to be able to allow more registrants into the space, and it looks like it is starting to flow. So thank you, Reed, for the troubleshooting, and our apologies for that at the beginning here, folks. And so as part of our virtual platform today, we are offering live captioning, which you can see on your screen, and you have the option to turn that on or off, as you so wish. During the question and answer portion after the presentations, you're welcome to use either the raise hand function or to type your question in the chat. If we come to your question, I will call on you and you may unmute at that time to ask your question, or if you don't have the internet bandwidth or not able to at that time, I'm happy to read it out loud if helpful. Otherwise, we ask that you stay on mute to eliminate any background noise. And this intro and the presentation portions of the event are being recorded, and then the recording will be turned off for the Q&A portion. And without further ado, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce James Rattling and Gwen Bridge here with us to share their work on building relational and effective partnerships with Indigenous communities. A little bit of background on James and Gwen, and then they will introduce themselves more fully when in turn. So currently, James is a research associate at the Cooperative Institute Research Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder, as well as a co-principal investigator at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And James specializes in developing programs that utilize the interface between Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge and Western science. He has over 25 years of experience serving as a cross-cultural broker, resource to federal government, higher education institutions, and nonprofits, to developing, maintaining positive ongoing working relationships with federally and non-federally recognized tribes, tribal college and universities, and tribal communities. And he sees a greater vision of human knowledge that incorporates the many insights of human cultures and provides a context for a better understanding of the planet and the world. James is a founding member of the group on Earth Observations, Geo-Indigenous Alliance, that was established at the GEO Week 2019 in Canberra, Australia, to foster a continued, effective, respectful, and reciprocal relationship with GEO and representatives of Indigenous communities from around the world. James was born on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and is an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. And we also have with us Gwen Bridge, who is a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation in Alberta, Canada. Gwen works on developing relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples to support better natural resource management and Indigenous equity. Generating a deeper understanding of Indigenous knowledge and legislative frameworks by non-Indigenous peoples underlies all of Gwen's work. And she has worked with Indigenous nations in the US and Canada on natural resources management and Indigenous rights protection, including as a hydrologist for for the Mescalero Apache tribe and a restoration ecology manager at the Makah tribe and natural resources manager for the Okanagan Nation. Gwen has run her consulting firm since 2010 and has worked with many Indigenous nations across Canada. Gwen supports municipal and provincial governments, nonprofits, universities, and the corporate sector on Indigenous relations and engagement management, including the Cascadia Partner Forum on including Indigenous knowledge in the International Climate Change Adaptation Strategy. Gwen is currently negotiating tribal governmental agreements to establish a national park reserve in the lower Similkameen Indian Band Territory and Caribou Recovery in the Okanagan Nation Territory. Gwen has a Master of Science in Renewable Resources from the University of Alberta in Alberta, Canada. And their presentations with us today are going to outline recommendations for working with Indigenous communities based on the knowledge that long-term relationship building with these communities is the foundation upon which educational programs, research collaborations, and other initiatives must be co-created. And their presentations will define best practices in building relationships and clarifying a process for establishing and maintaining effective collaborations with Indigenous communities that respect sovereignty and self-determination. And so with that, thank you all very much for being here, and I will turn it over to James.
Hi, and Wopila Tonka Chichiapalo, Julie, for that introduction, and say Daya Yahaipi, and welcome to our session today, and real grateful for the opportunity to be with the Rising Voices community and its partners and allies. How be Nakia be Chante West and Napechus Apollo, James Rattling Leafy Macha Pina Shichanga Lakoto Oyate Himataha. I reach you today from my heart with a handshake, and I am known as James Rattling, and I am from the Rosewood Sioux tribe. And it's a great privilege and honor to be with you. And this, Julie said, special session, special occasion. So I'll take that anytime from Julie Maldonado to be special, to be part of something that's good. And I'm real thankful for the Rising Voices community and all you who are listening and watching today. The work that you do, real grateful for this network and what you do, and really the possibilities again going forward. So I take these opportunities with great responsibility with the words that I share in particular, that it's done in a good way and it's from my heart to you for the benefit of all of us. So let's go ahead and get started with my slides. Well, thank you again, and thank you, and real good to be with you today. So I'm coming to you from the traditional homelands of the Oceti Shankomi, or the Great Sioux Nation here in South Dakota. And as Julie mentioned in the introduction, I've been, sort of been around for a while now, and really working, at that really interesting space between tribal cultures and the greater society. And when we started talking with Julie about this talk or this presentation, I welcomed and brought in Miss Gwen Bridge as well, and you'll hear from her as well after this. And again, we wanted to think about, maybe two different perspectives from certainly two different tribes, but also two different experiences, and really trying to bring to you the things that we've learned over the years, and be willing to share those things with you, so that that if it's helpful to you, that's great. But also that we do this because we're in community with you, and we know that the challenges that we face, not only as Indigenous people, but as the world, we're reminded every day about those. And so we see in the news so many things, but also we also hear that through these big events, global events, that there is a real interest, a real need again to engage with tribal people, Indigenous people. And so I've lived long enough to see this come about. And so today I'm going to share some examples of what I've done. It's not everything I've done, but it's just things I picked out, I think, that are relevant for today, knowing that there's so much work to be done, but yet we find ourselves today in community with Rising Voices. So with that, I'll start with my talk. Um, I do think that, we acknowledge that there is a need to restore the balance and care for people and for Earth. I think despite everything we've had, our technologies, our data, and our science, we still struggle with the problems that we have. Those of us from the indigenous communities, for sure, we talk about this, raising consciousness of people and of all people. And finally, I do believe and I do practice that we do need all ways of knowing. Next slide. So, my question for us today is, what are the opportunities for greater understandings and collaborations with different ways of knowing? Next slide. So, in my time, my history and my education and my experience really comes from St. University, one of the 32 tribal colleges across this country and Canada. And I share this knowledge. This is a picture of St. or Spotted Tail. And we honor our university, we honor him by naming our university after him with these values of bravery, generosity, wisdom, and fortitude. And I like this saying that we have in Lakota, is Uchi Maka Tawon Ospe Wakita, intergenerational knowledge transfer utilizing the Lakota worldview. So we have that mandate from our founders, from our ancestors, saying that as a university, this is our great mission, our great vision. And so the bringing together of a Lakota way of knowing with higher education is what really influenced me from that beginning of coming to college for the first time, being the first one in my own family to get a degree. Has been my journey. And so I began there in terms of respecting all those who sacrificed their careers in a way to really build an institution like St. as well as other tribal colleges and universities across this country. But it's really, again, it's self-determination, it's tribal sovereignty, and it comes to education. And I always acknowledge them. So whatever I do good in my life, whatever I can do good, I remember those who've gone before me and those who are still there working with the next generation. Next slide. So, in the work that I started at St. University, it really began by my mentor, by our Itancha, or our president of SGU. So when I began to work with science and technology and our culture, this is what he told me. And I always use this quote because it helps, I think, it helped me, but helps us understand, from his perspective of why we do what we did at St. So I'm going to read it. I think it's powerful. St. University was started by its founding fathers to strengthen the Sicangu Rosebud Nation in all aspects of life. As such, this initiative will assist us in bringing two of the essential points of life, the sky and the earth, together spiritually and technically. So Dr. Lionel Border, who's still the president today, gave me this quote, gave me the permission and provided me the leadership and also responsibility to approach developing programs at St. University with science and earth observations. And so it was this guidance that I remember. And I think as you think about understanding working in tribal colleges, we still have leaders like this who are still with us today. You can still provide that wisdom that we need as we get into these aspects of science and culture and working on the big problems like climate change. Next slide. So one of the things that we did, and I think in terms of engagement with tribal Indigenous people and partners, is that we signed a Memorandum of Understanding in 2000. And so that picture is a young James Rattling leaf there. This was signed in 2000, so over almost 22 years ago that this was signed. And we did that with our elders, and we did it with a principle that we call Wolakota. And it's a peacemaking process. It's a peacemaking value that we used to sign that memorandum. And you have the director of the USGS, United States Geological Survey, there on Rosebud, and our president signed this agreement. And in some ways, it was a modern day treaty that we had our leaders, our traditional leaders, our families that signed some of the original treaties back in 1863 1850. Their descendants were there at this meeting. And when we asked to plan this, they strongly encouraged us that we brought those people in as part of the ceremony, but also part of their support. And they spoke at this gathering when we signed this agreement. But I think it was for me personally, it was a powerful moment in my life because I never thought I would do this kind of work. But I think it's necessary because this is really driven by an executive order signed by President Clinton. I remember it's 13021, EO 1321. And in some ways, we need those federal agencies' guidance and executive orders to work with federal governments, for instance, and that's what we used. But I really liked it because in that picture there, you also have Albert Whitehat wearing his wapaha or his headdress, and also with the eagle feathers, and he spoke into this agreement of kind of how we did it and why we did it this way. And so that was really my first foray into partnership building, collaboration, and really utilizing the Lakota way of doing things and how we honored our ancestors and how we honored that process. Next slide. So one of the things that I do like, I'm very proud of, is that we did develop products. We did develop something that brought together traditional knowledge and Western science, and it was really around mapping and Earth observation data. So this was something we call ResMapper, and even though this was done many years ago, again, I use it as an example of how we, during that time, tried to bring together two ways of knowing. We brought together the people in our communities on Rosebud. We brought together data sources, data providers. Again, through an agreement under that Wolakota principle, we are allowed to share information, put information into a computer program called ResMapper, and be able to share that and distribute that among our tribe. This was our first effort really to bring awareness to data, bring awareness to the type of information available, like remote sensing, like GIS, but also we included other types of data like pictures and like video and like photographs. So this was really ahead of its time. This was done like in 2003. So now that we have these advanced technologies, but at the time this was powerful. And again, I just want to highlight one thing is we defined what GIS or remote sensing was in our own language. Again, it was all built upon our relationship between creation to those things that walk, the four-legged, the flying beings, and we all did it in something, again, what called Wolakota. It's that unifying principle that creates the relationship, and it creates understanding, and also, again, it creates responsibility that once we take this on, then we got to take care of it. We got to do it in a good way, and it has to be useful and good for all people. Next slide. And so here's some images of the ResMapper product. Again, we put in our treaty, we put in community histories, to strike. We put in different data sources and things like that. So again, it was our way to localize the data that was necessary to bring support from the community, the 20 communities on Rosebud. So they would see that this was really done for their benefit. And so we were really happy to do it that way. Next slide. My next example is my work at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And so I started this work with CU about 4 years ago, and I was asked to help lead the tribal engagement section of that work. So it's all about working with tribal resource managers and helping them provide climate data and science with them and to them. One thing I want to highlight in this work is the development of this, which is and still is a new master's program at CU. We called it the Tribal Climate Leaders Program, and we even defined it from our elders in the Lakota way, even though all these students aren't Lakota, but we did ask an elder to help us define it. And so what he told me was, what we're trying to do, James, with this program is to pay attention to the Grandmother Earth teachings. So we were trying to create a space for our students to bring their own cultural knowledge, their own cultural experiences, along with our elders and cultural knowledge holders and bearers, as well as the faculty and the staff at the University of Colorado Boulder. So these pictures are our 5 cohorts, and it's been a real honor for me to work with them. And so my job was to help recruit them, to help define the program, and then also support them in their next year. So they're on their last year now. This is their final year, their final semester, and each 5 of these students will have a master's degree program on a fellowship that we funded. again, with the hope that we're going to build upon it for the future. So again, this is an example, I think, that what the tribes are telling us in terms of engagement was really the future. And with these 5 students, they'll be able to work with tribes in our region on climate projects and climate programs. And each person here in this slide are doing different things related to climate. Some is plants, some is soil, some is air, some is water. But they're bringing their expertise back to the tribes, and we're really happy to do that. And we hope that we can continue this work going forward. The next slide. The other example I want to bring is something called the Oceti-Sakowin. For the past 2 years, I've been working with this group. Again, this is what is called known as the original Sioux Nation or Sioux tribes. And so this is a regional effort. And so they asked me to come in and help them work on climate adaptation work. And so I just want to bring awareness to you that you may know this, you may not know this, but really the importance of working with tribal governments and working with treaties and working with organizations that have a treaty focus, and to remember and recognize again the importance of those treaties today. And so I share this map here with you again, sort of the geographic extent of what areas that we want to work in. And so it's really important, I think, that when you think about working with tribal nations, that there's a treaty aspect to it. And so it's always good that you inform yourself by reading and studying these treaties and why they still matter today. Next slide. So here's some of the work that's been done at this point, but this is a logic model of some of the things that this Oceti-Sakowin work is working on and what they want to focus on. And again, I'm always reminded about the knowledge that we have as tribal people today. And when you combine that with alliances like the Oceti-Sakowin, that was historical and that was ancestral, but it's also still current, it gives you an example of work that's done so far and how they wants to work at an international level, a national level, local level, community level, at the family level. And when you think about working with tribal nations, it's not so much always the government. It's always really looking at this impact on families. So I just want to highlight that this is work that's happening right now. And I'm involved, others are involved, and we hope to support it with what we do. Next slide. And so my last example I want to share with you is working at the global level. 2 years ago, I was asked to give the intervention for our country, United States of America, at this meeting in Canberra, Australia. And out of that meeting came something called the Geo-Indigenous Alliance. And so we have a vision through this alliance to protect and sustain Indigenous cultural heritage, utilizing and contributing to global Earth observation, science, data, and technology. So these pictures are people who I met for the first time. And also I'm really happy that I was able to take my flag, the Rosebud Sioux tribe, to this meeting, international meeting, and to talk about my people and my tribe to this global audience about who we are again as Lakota people and the importance of self-determination and tribal sovereignty. And so I came as a representative of my nation as well as being a delegate from America. And in that meetings, in those convocations, we were able to come up with this vision for the Geo-Indigenous Alliance. And so we've been working for the past 2 years to implement an organization governed by Indigenous principles and looking at United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People and all sort of those efforts to date. And so that was important for me in terms of my own professional development as an Indigenous person to expand my work. And I do find that you'll see that there's great learning opportunities to work with Indigenous people around the world. So it's been a bit and is an honor to represent our country in this special moment, but also to know that there's a lot of work to do and we all can be a part of it. Next slide. So I do believe that, some certain aspects of all these 3 examples is that the importance of data. And so I want to conclude with the importance of data. And so I say that every tribe or every nation has a data story. Next slide. And so we're really happy in this work with data to gain support from rising voices. This language here and these ideas here are really from a grant that we won. We were gifted to by Rising Voices. And so again, this is the importance of how we approach data, working with our tribes in the Great Plains through the Oceti-Sakowin. And so that, that we looked at this idea of data governance, we looked at our data planning, We know that tribes in our area are still looking for economic opportunity. And finally, the importance of tribal sustainability. When we start something like this, it's important that we have a good plan and a good idea of how to continue it if it's useful. We looked at it as from a regional perspective because we really wanted to work across these areas, and we wanted to, through a larger group of people, to find the expertise or find the interests that would help carry these initiatives forward, to help support it and to strengthen it through a regional effort. And then finally, again, I would say that in this work, it's important that that we look at the workforce side of it, the future. And so everything that we do through this work has a capacity building or capacity development part of it. And so that as this work continues, we're finding greater and greater interest in learning more about what data sovereignty means and how can it be applied today. So it's important, I think, for you as scientists and as leaders that you begin to dig into this whole idea of tribal data sovereignty. And when you do research in partnership with tribal nations, you're going to find that that's going to be a core part of your agreements and how you do this work and how the data is collected, who owns the data, how that's going to be shared, how that's going to be archived and such. So there's a tremendous opportunity, but also a challenge for you and for us in dealing with the data issues. Next slide. So in our findings through this project, that we understand that these are questions that we were posed by tribal nations. Again, tribal nations are still trying to rebuild and try to realize and understand what happened to us. We're trying to find out better ways to collect data. I know we just conducted the census here in America, and I was hearing stories today, even from our tribal leaders, about how that work wasn't done that well, and that a lot of people were not counted or miscounted. And so there's still a great effort to understand how we do data collection, data work with tribal nations. This idea of data governance is really important, I think, is that the data that we collect, the data that we work with, data that we're using, how does that really going to impact governance of tribal nations and tribal governments? I think through that work, we're finding that more and more tribes are coming together to share how they're working with data, both from America as well as Canada. So this idea of community practice is starting to come together, and that's really exciting. And I think that as this community builds, I think you're seeing more and more conferences and opportunities come about where this whole topic of data sovereignty will be part of those discussions, because we do need all voices at that table. And then how we talk about those things, I think, is really important. Next slide. So, in really thinking about this, we're still telling our story in our way. We've always been, I believe, information gatherers and information keepers. We had things like winter counts and those kind of things. Maybe your tribe has those as well. And so we had people who collected that data, who took care of that data, who interpret that data. So our ancestors really had that skill. And then you couple that with a spiritual outlook, a spiritual understanding. Again, this really creates this story of who we are and what's most important to our people and how we care about that. But we also know that we live also in a new time now. So we got to create these new stories. We have to create these ways to help kind of sustain our people and lead the way into the future. Next slide. So I think there are opportunities. I want to close with this. I think there are opportunities. I'm thankful for Rising Voices as a platform to share ideas and share opportunities, which I've taken advantage of that. I certainly shared things I've been part of, and I'm glad to read to others who are doing this. So next slide. And so these White House memorandums that you probably saw come down, Secretary Holland visited South Dakota last month in December. And it was really based on two memorandums, how I understand it. One was the co-management of federal lands, development guidance on that, and also development of guidance of what they call indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And so I do think that there are efforts really to get involved in those efforts. And in my interest in these things is that it's gonna require, again, these two different ways of knowing. And now that we have a government now that wants to dig into those things, certainly there's a lot more questions and answers at this point, how these memorandums will impact land management on federal lands. But for the first time in my life, again, I'm seeing the tribes coming together to even discuss what co-management means, and even the idea about traditional knowledge again, how is that going to be shared? How's that going to be protected? Who's going to own that and things like that? So these memorandum of understandings, I'm certainly getting involved in that. I'm getting to know the leadership of those memorandum in federal government, and I'm really excited to begin to start those conversations. And so we're going to do some work on the traditional knowledge one. We're going to invite the White House, the lady who's leading it from the White House is going to be part of our webinar series in March, and she's going to give us an update on the memorandum and the whole process of how they're going to develop the guidance. And so I encourage you to keep track of our TEK section webinars, and we're going to have her there, and we're really happy to welcome her and to speak with us. Also, I think that the co-management aspect of it again is another idea that I think that's time has come, and I think that we're going to find more and more of these opportunities again to work with tribes and federal agencies to do the work, especially working in climate adaptation and those sort of things as well. So I want to move on to my final slide next. Again, I just want to leave you with this, and I always want to leave with a quote from one of our elders. And so he says, if we're going to save the earth, we're going to need to communicate with creation. I advise you to go back to creation, talk to them. The only way we can save our grandmother, the earth, is to get reattached. I admonish young people not to wait. It's good to communicate with your relatives. Again, this was shared from my mentor, who I miss greatly, and who helped me, and he is a late Upper White Hat, Sichanga Lakota Oyate. Next slide. So with that, I want to thank you. Say Wopila Tanka Chichiapalo. Thank you all very much for listening to me. And again, this is a project on Rosebud called the Wolokota, and you can contribute. You can get involved in it. Again, it's bringing back the buffalo to our people, to our tribal lands. Again, to strengthen the bond between people, buffalo, and the land. So you can go to that website and make a contribution if you want to. But I just want you to be aware of that. It's good things. Again, it's bringing together traditional knowledge and Western science for the benefit of the people, the buffalo, and the land. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Gwen. I also wanted to say this as well, Julie, that I'm glad that Gwen and I met about 2 years ago, and now that we're beginning to work together on things, I'm happy to welcome her to Rising Voices. And so with that, I want to thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, James, for your shared wisdom, and always as your calls to action. So we'll be looking for more, and happy to share and disseminate information as it's available. We'll be turning over to Gwen now. I just wanted to let folks know our apologies for a bit of the issues with the chat. But if you're anything like me, and if you have a question and you don't put it down in that moment, it's gone from your head. So you are certainly welcome to, in the chat, you can at least direct message to me if you have questions that have arisen so far, and we'll come to those. And then after Gwen speaks, we will come where you can raise hand and ask questions. But just if you have something burning that you don't want to lose your train of thought, please feel free to direct message those to me, and we'll get to them when we come to our Q&A. So with that, I will thank you again, James, and we'll turn it over to Gwen.
Thanks all. Hi, Tanse. My name's Gwen, as Julie said in the introduction. So happy to be here. Thanks, James, and thanks, Julie, for having me and allowing me to share the work that I've been doing on building better Indigenous relationships. So this is, this talk is building relational and effective partnerships with Indigenous communities. For the work that I've been doing over the years, generating these better agreements and things, I came to this framework, which is really useful, and I'll describe in this talk, called Ethical Space, and how we apply Indigenous knowledge within the context of this ethical space-based framework, one, to understand it and then to apply it. So I really appreciate all of James's best practices he shared about all of the examples of good relationships being built throughout. Some of the work that I'll talk to about ethical space and some of that understanding is being able to continue to build and deepen our understanding. James talked about the need to, his mentor's instructions to connect with the creator and with creation. So I'll talk a little bit about the significance of that from some Indigenous perspectives about how we can build an understanding of what that really means. So I'll get into the talk, and I'll close that video. So next slide. So, we're all here and we all want to do really, really good things. And so I like to start with this, why are we trying to do this work? Why are we trying to have better collaborations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, between scientists and Indigenous peoples, these types of things? This wasn't always the case. James described some of the evolution, but there's this long history of challenges, right? And it's really cool in this time where we can have this desire and really a beginning wherewithal to build excellent relationships between the two. So as a society and trying to make our world consistently better and co-creating our future, really, it's an exciting opportunity to get creative. So, we want to make sure that we resolve conflicts which perpetuate inequality. We're all familiar with the inequalities that pervade our society. So really wanting to do that. We need to be consistent with the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people. That's an agreement that was generated from long discussions and negotiations between Indigenous people about how best to protect, assert, and have their rights recognized and protected. So that's important. James mentioned the Biden memos and whatnot. That's got to be important steps forward for this application of UNDRIP. In Canada, it's really important. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's this ecological imperative, right? And I remember from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in September, the nation states and others talking about the need to really empower Indigenous people to manage their own lands, because within those lands, that's where natural resource management happens well. That's where biodiversity is conserved. For example, 80% of the world's biodiversity remains within Indigenous controlled lands. So when we're thinking about all of the initiatives with the Biden memo and inclusion of TEK and conservation, those larger considerations for the importance of this work for our ecological salvation, if you will, is really important. So there's these imperatives, moral, legal, and ecological imperatives to do this work better. I talked about UNDRIP. So how do we begin to build the foundation for us to do this important work? We need to understand things around the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in North America in particular. This is really important. We build on that good work Indigenous people did. In Canada in particular, we talk about this notion of reconciliation. It's just a concept which means resolving conflict, right? And so how do we begin to do that? What are some of the ideas? And I'll talk a little bit about that. What are some of the structural characteristics of society which underpin those particular worldviews, what we're trying to reconcile? So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then just a continued emphasis of some of these deep challenges and how we move forward in a better discourse and using ethical space. So my point here, and I'll illuminate this as we go forward, is just to really be open-minded and creative, right? And to really understand the opportunities we as individuals have, we as organizations have, we as partnerships have to build our work together. Next slide. So UNDRIP, I'll talk about my work, and it really underpins, it creates this opportunity. James mentioned the need to have things like executive orders. In Canada, we have these commitments to make all the laws consistent with UNDRIP. So you'll see that probably coming forward. So yes, it's important to have that sort of state colonial government recognition of Indigenous rights, and their obligations in UNDRIPs can be summarized in this way. Firstly, to acknowledge and recognize Indigenous rights, to protect those rights, and then to pay to protect, redress, mitigate impacts to those rights. So it's really this sort of three-tiered set of obligations. One of the things that's interesting when we think about Indigenous sovereignty and in the States, sort of these treaty arrangements between sovereign nations, is that in Canada in particular, they didn't take their treaty obligations very seriously. And so this whole exercise of being able to have these discourses around the application of UNDRIP is, this is, me being a little cynical, is really at the benevolence of these nation states. So I don't think we're at the point of true equity yet, but it provides the opportunity to begin to have those conversations which build understanding about the need to persevere in generating equity between nations. All right, next. UNDRIP, a couple particular slides, you can click next, there should be one thing, yeah. A couple of particular articles, there's a lot of mention about free, prior, and informed consent. I'll talk about that later, but there's a couple of really cool things that sort of underpin the way that I think about building relationships and understanding. Is this Article 27 is about Indigenous people's laws, right? So if you think back to Indigenous rights in UNDRIP, and their right is to manifest their own laws, right? And to adjudicate those Indigenous laws. Then you're looking at a system, a sort of a parallel legislative framework, which creates obligations not only for Indigenous peoples, but for others who reside on these sort of territorial lands. So Indigenous people are codifying their law, codifying their law, which existed orally, but now it's being translated into whatever language, typically English, and then developing these adjudication mechanisms for considering how violations of that law will be provided with consequence within that system. Next. Oh, one of the things I'll talk about as I get into the framework is this notion of science. And so James talked about data, the importance of science, the importance of understanding two worldviews, this kind of thing. The point I'll make later is that when we talk about the manifestation of Indigenous sciences, we need to be, those of us who are science, and I happen to be one of those, really begin to expand our definition of what science means. So when we read science, we're not bringing all of our assumptions about the scientific methodology and the rigor and the reductionism, but it's much more broader, and I'll describe that broadness in a moment. Next. Did it go next? Yeah, okay. So reconciliation, I mentioned in Canada, there's this, a lot of momentum around the need to reconcile, right? And this came out of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was this Truth and Reconciliation process to get a handle on what happened in residential schools and how we could begin to move forward over that terrible tragedy that was imposed upon Indigenous people. It's modeled on the Truth and Reconciliation work out of South Africa related to apartheid. So that was a good thing. And I know in the States now, you've just begun, I think, the Secretary Howland talking about the need to get under the Band-Aid of or whatever's happened in residential school in the States too, and all the bodies that came back to Rosebud and other places, and in Canada too, all the graves of children. And so how do we begin to have those conversations about what happened, how do we heal, all of that kind of stuff. So there's these 94 calls to actions, and they're great: language, culture, education, all of that kind of stuff. But what underpins them all is this foundational concept that in order to have reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous societies, the first relationship that must heal is this relationship of Indigenous people to their land. So when we think about all of the efforts we're making towards reconciliation, all of those efforts are really primarily, should be or could be, directed at how to support the healing of the relationship of Indigenous people to their land, right? And again, it gets back to that connection to creation, connection to nature, and connection to a different way of relating to the earth. Next. So how do we do this reconciliation? There's no one definition of reconciliation. As I mentioned, it's how to resolve conflict, the need to resolve a conflict. Well, what is that conflict, right? I'll talk about that in a moment, but this process of what reconciliation is, right? For me, it really means developing a shared vision. When we talk about, you know, James's work in Sintigleska and all these different kinds of agreements, and I have a couple of examples too, really, what are we trying to achieve together? And you hear a lot also about this notion of two-eyed seeing. So I really like that metaphor because it provides a real tangible understanding of why you need to develop that vision together, right? Because you're looking ahead to a place in the future. And if you only have one eye, you can look towards that vision. But when you open two eyes, you're off target again, right? That vision moves, that target moves, right? And if so, with either eye, you're trying to create that vision. Once you bring that relationship in and open both eyes, you lose that target. So it's really important, and Indigenous people have been saying this, work with us from the outside, from the outset, from the establishment of that vision. Let's do that together, right? And how do we do that? We need to understand, generate that deeper understanding of the processes and mechanisms and fundamental concepts that underpin the way that we would generate that vision on the Indigenous side. Next slide. So I think I just made this point, but about two-eyed seeing. And the point of ethical space, which I think is the next slide, is that when we take information from both of those eyes, generate this collaborative vision, what happens is happening within this brain. So you sort of see this partnership is kind of the brain entity, which brings these two together. Something happens there where you're creating something, creating understanding from those two sets of input, right? And I think that that's, again, a good metaphor because that's ethical space. Next slide. So so that sort of alchemy, whatever happens to generate this this collaboration is this collective brain in a way. So this is called, I really like this framework. It's called Ethical Space, and I first heard it when Reg Croshu gave a talk at CAMWR a few years ago, talking about ethical space, and talked about it so eloquently, and I could never do that justice, but he wrote about it too in this Voices of Understanding that was published by the Alberta Energy Regulator, talking about ethical space and the need to develop this new way of relating to each other, which is based on this deep understanding, bringing forward into the space what components of each society are important, and doing so in a way that's consistent with cultural safety protocols from whatever side. There's a lot to explore there, but I won't get into all of that. But what I want to say next is, well, what do we bring forward? What's important to understand in these systems of Western written culture and Indigenous oral culture? Next slide. So when we're generating an understanding of the other, we take the onus on ourselves as the party that's going to bring forward understanding, to bring forward what's important. And so Western side, Canadian American side, has brought forward, things that understandings related to politicians. This is just a short list, but science and religion and values, certain sets of values, a patriarchy, this age of enlightenment, the concepts of reductionism and the scientific method, and democratic governance and constitutions and these types of things, right? And I think Indigenous people, for the most part, understand those elements really well because they've been so effectively imposed through residential school and things like the Indian Act in Canada and whatever act governs all of the BIA fiduciary obligations in the States, for example. But what's less understood within this space and by non-Indigenous participants is what's on the Indigenous side. So what comes forward, things like traditional ecological knowledge, stories, protocols, chiefs' values, different sets of values, Indigenous governance. I think Julie talked a little bit about the need to develop the community-based governance, right? There's different mechanisms of governance. Spirituality, how do we begin to understand the importance of the spiritual in decision-making within societies? And then community. So go forward. Thank you. So the work that I've been doing is like, okay, well, what do we need to bring forward as Indigenous people, and for those communities that I work with and who I am, really, it's like, well, how do we make sure that the other side understands some of this? So we were thinking, and one of my colleagues, Rob Edward, and I in particular, were thinking, well, what is the challenge? What needs to be understood? What is the real essence of the conflict here between us when we have challenges resolving issue-based things like where to fish or where to pollute or all these kinds of things? There never seems to be the sort of real reconciled perspective. There may be compromise and agreement on these topical areas, but on the Indigenous side, as an Indigenous person, I never felt like I was understood, like, why is it actually important that these things happen? And they're like, well, yeah, you need to eat berries or whatever, right? But that's not, that didn't really feel like it was generating this understanding about the importance, right? So we started thinking about it. And people behave, individuals, organizations behave in a way and manifest behaviors which are a product of the society in which they live, right? So we're all acting in accordance with values and protocols and mores absorbed from our particular societies. And so we're thinking, well, there's something different in there with the structure of society, because we act differently in these relationships and with the land and with each other and things like that. So we began to think about that. And the question is, well, where, if people behave a certain way, there's a certain authority which is governing their behavior. And that's essentially the definition of law, right? So what laws are guiding the way that we're behaving, right? And so we started to think about, well, who makes the law? Where does that authority come from? And we kind of came up with this concept of understanding fundamentally some of these differences. And I'll describe this just through this slide right now. So on this Western side is it starts with God, like sort of God has this ultimate authority, like the creator. Same on the Indigenous side, there's a creator, right? And most societies in the world have these kinds of concepts of creation, which are from the metaphysical, right? From the sort of abstract universe, if you will. And so so this on the Western side, God is like, okay, well, doing his thing, and then says, okay, you know, here's Earth and all the things on it, and humans, you get to have this authority. You get to make the decisions about what happens. You get to create the laws. You tell what happens among these things. We know in the, sort of the Christian philosophy, it's the dominion over Earth, right? And it's like, okay, well, that's cool. And then so then what happens? That human entity, and I put Queen here. Because I'm in Canada and we still are, our head of state is the Queen. Interesting, we're not a republic like the States. So my American colleagues, well, it's like humans. They didn't really resonate with the Queen, but the point is this human entity then tells what the authority is through laws, constitutions, legislation, policy, and then ultimately you have what happens on the land or management. And I put science down there and I'll describe that in a moment. Why that's down there. But now I'll sort of describe this this concept we were thinking deeply about and came up with this framework. It's not a pan-Indigenous framework, and I'm not suggesting this applies to every Indigenous nation, but it's been useful in the context with which I'm working in Canada and the United States, and those tribes and First Nations with whom I've been working and who I am. So so when the creator's out there doing its creation, and then in a lot of examples, the actual creation, the earth and the animals and the winged ones and the fish and the underground ones and all that kind of stuff, they came first and they were given the authority to determine what happens to humanity. There's some examples. One of them is sort of the Okanagan. It's like, okay, well, the creator said, you animals, bear, Saskatoon berry, fish, salmon, and bitterroot, they're called the 4 food chiefs. So the creator said, well, these humans are coming to the earth. You need to decide what to do with them, right? What are you going to do? They're kind of feeble, don't really know how to, they don't have any fur and claws and stuff. So you're going to have to help them. And so all these animals said, okay, well, we're going to lay down our lives so that they can live. That's our decision, right? And there's certain now obligations and relationships that will be established between ourselves and between us and them. And so the question is, well, those animals actually decided what the rules were going to be for human behavior, right? And so those rules got described through story by humanity. All of these stories about creation, about the animals, about those rules that we're supposed to abide by based on natural law, essentially, right? Animal prescribed law, plant prescribed law. Those stories are the representation in human society of those laws, right? And then those stories contain protocols and management prescriptions, and then create this life, right? So this authority about how we behave came from different places. On one side, it came from sort of the humanity. Well, it came from creator, right? And everything comes from the creator. But after that, the authority comes on the one side from the human cohort, and on the Indigenous side from the non-human cohort, right? Next slide. So, you know, it's like, okay, well, this kind of is helping us understanding some of the conflicts we have around, for example, the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge into science and policy documents, right? So you go back to, don't actually go back, but when we reflect back on Reg's diagram of ethical space, there isn't an overlap. Like there's this inclusion, incorporation, integration, all these I words, I don't know why they're all I, but people are trying to sort of overlap this Venn diagram, right? Where you have the two places, trying to find what's common and what's similar between the two. And this was always a challenge for me, because people would come with just well-intentioned to say, okay, we really want to have this information, right? And then we'll use it in policy. And it's like, well, that's doesn't sit right for some reason. And so we attempted to think through that challenge, because what would happen, and there's an example, this institute at the University of Victoria called Paulus Center for Watershed Governance, all around water and all this kind of stuff. So I was reviewing this report they had written, contributing to it, and reading through the report, and throughout the report, they're like, we need Indigenous knowledge, we need more TEK, you know, we got to do better relationships. At the end of the document, they said, we hope this plan will inform policy, right? This scientific-based plan will inform policy. And so what they basically said is that you're taking that TK. So if you have Earth here, there's a little slide. Typically I draw on it, but that's not possible now. You sort of say traditional ecological knowledge is all of that knowledge contained in that top layer, that those stories, right? And so all of that law, that science I mentioned, like Indigenous science is Indigenous law is Indigenous story, because it's all contained within that knowledge. So when people talk about Indigenous knowledge on the Indigenous side, it contains that holistic perspective of all of the different things which govern society: social relations, ecological relations, you know, relations between, well, those are all the things, law, right? And so what happens then is on the Western side, people are trying to take that information and put it into management plans, into policy documents, and well-intentioned, right? Because they see that as an equivalent to science-based information. And it is, because both are essentially Earth observation-based ways of understanding and interpreting what's happening in the world, right? So scientists go out and say, oh, let's measure this and look at this, draw conclusions and make recommendations. Okay, that's cool. And then on Indigenous side, it's like, okay, let's listen to the story. Let's understand what we're being told to do. Let's interpret how we're going to apply that and what happens then in making recommendations, right? So there is a lot of equivalency between the two ways of understanding and interpreting Earth-based information. What happens then, though, is that when the scientific side says, give us that information, we'll incorporate into policy, you're basically subjugating the highest level of the law to a place which doesn't have any inherent legal authority, right? We all know what happens in this policy validation feedback loop. Scientists are like, well, we should do something about climate change because the Earth is screaming at us to change. And yet they're subject to the policy validation feedback loop, which is like, okay, well, if you want to put down policy, we got to find the money. We got to be consistent with other laws and policies. We have to sort of adhere to the whims of the elected person who's a policymaker, those types of things. And so that's sort of, when we're talking about reconciliation, it's like, well, how is that process supporting reconciliation, right? Because it's by default a process of subjugation of all of the information and law that's contained within traditional ecological knowledge. So a bit of a challenge. Next slide. So I think there's a lot of things, a lot of terminology, a lot of work, a lot of thinking done around decolonization, right? And I'm not really sure what that means, except sort of taking away some of these colonial approaches. And I'm sure that I don't know enough about all of that stuff, but I really like this term of indigenization, which when we're thinking about relationship and ethical space, it's about generating this new way of holding the world together. There's like a big digger outside my window. Anyway, so we have to think, well, how do we resolve that fundamental challenge? And I think one of the important things about bringing this forward is to say, okay, there's these different ways of understanding law and TK and Earth-based observations. There's different authorities and associated with that. So when we're on the Western side and we're trying to have relationship with Indigenous people, and we sort of keep those relationships within a scientific or Earth observation-based set of knowledge, it doesn't recognize that this whole set of law is part of that. And so I think when we're trying to resolve in the space between, it's thinking, so my work, and I'll talk about a little bit about the National Park Reserve project I'm working on, negotiating with the federal and provincial governments around, well, what do we do? How do we generate understanding? So, and how do we build agreements based on understanding these types of frameworks? So quickly, it's like, well, they talk about the National Parks Act on the Canadian side, right? Well, what's in there? A set of rules about how to behave. Don't pollute, hunt animals in this season, don't overgraze, all of these kinds of things. So we began to look at, well, what are the stories in the Indigenous culture that we're representing at this table? What are those stories which contain similar guidance? And so we look through the stories and it's like, well, this horse story tells don't pollute and the horses must be away from water or something like that, right? So we're really trying to develop those equivalencies in law, and equating law with story, right? And so that's important. And I'll just go to the next slide now. So there's obviously a lot in these topics, and I feel like I'm skimming through quite quickly. But when we think about some of the legislative frameworks that are coming forward, and I talked about Indigenous nations generating or codifying their law. I mean, the law exists within people, within the society. They don't need to write it down for their own benefit, but in order to bring forward into ethical space this deeper understanding of what's important, nations are beginning to articulate and codify their laws based on their stories and things like that, right? So that work is going forward. And so it's important to be able to pull that in. And there's, this work doesn't just start now. Indigenous people have been saying what their law is for a long, long time. But now, again, because of the states are now obligated to begin to listen to that and begin to understand that. There's an interesting policy document that goes back 112 years in Canada, which effectively states Indigenous law-based policy for how to have these relations. And it says here, these people wish to be partners with us in our country. We must therefore be the same as brothers to them and live as one family. We will share equally in everything, half and half in land, water, and timber. What is ours will be theirs, and what is theirs will be ours. We will help each other to be good and great. Right, so I think that's an awesome policy statement. It's completely unambiguous and very, very clear, right? Well, and I'm being ambiguous, but so when we look and say, well, what are Indigenous people really saying? It's okay, well, let's share equally. So why are we not able to share equally, right? It's because of all of the assumptions we bring forward about the validity of that Western legal-based framework, right? And when you look at the two frameworks side by side, and you see that really it's just a difference in sort of who's articulating the law, it's really difficult to claim a superiority or increased validity or credibility for one side, right? And so because these are just two manifestations from the infinite possibility for societal structure that exists in the universe, right? So how could one be more valid than the other? And I think when we're so indoctrinated, so sort of assimilated, so absorbed within our own culture, we don't question those assumptions very often. And that's been the biggest challenge from the governmental side in negotiations, is to say, well, why would your system be any more valid? What underpins that? And ultimately it's the same. And once they begin to understand that it's just this different way of framing out authority and law, it's like, okay, well, now we can begin to understand how potentially reconciliation could occur. Next slide. Yeah, lots to say on how that manifests, but I would say I wanted to talk about this quickly because it's an example of how we begin to have greater understanding of the other. It's to question the assumptions like we've been doing through this talk, right? About why things aren't working, how do we understand each other, and then what do we do to reconcile? This is another example. It's where you have another example of how our assumptions and indoctrination into our own society's beliefs manifest in natural resource management, right? And that's a lot of the challenges about why we have all the problems we have today, because we've been building on this, reinforcing the validity of this Western system. And so when we think about science and management, and we think about sort of typical planning of these theories of change, a lot of, many of you may have participated in theories of change. And so what I want to say about that, when I've observed those, is okay, well, when we're thinking through that process, a typical planning process, we think, the decisions we make will influence the outcome of a system. And I like to use water quality because I was a hydrologist for the Mescalero Apache for a few years. And I have a degree in hydrology. And so it's like, well, if we decide to pollute this water or not, we will have an outcome within the system. The water will be either dirty or clean, right? And so we go through with this idea that, we have to make a decision, right? What decision should we make? Whether not to pollute, or would the impacts be too great? So you have the entire, in the States, probably for sure, in Canada, the environmental assessment process is all designed around whether or not we should impact the system positively or negatively, right? A whole massive industry and a whole bunch of scientists and biologists hard at work and trying to do that, right? But the assumption there is that we get to make that decision to influence the outcome. On the Indigenous side, it's like, well, if the authority is imbued within this water, then the water says, oh, you must keep me clean, you have certain obligations for ceremony. I have the authority to sort of tell you to keep me clean, then what humans are making decisions which are consistent with that requirement. So their decisions are consistent with the system. So you kind of have this, well, you do have this sort of inverse, right? On the Western side, it's like our decisions impact the system, right? An outcome of the system. And on the Indigenous side, it's like the system, the outcome is already defined. So the decision must be consistent with that. So it's kind of, it is this inverse. And so when we think about the sort of results, the actual outcomes, the quantifiable differences, is that 80% of the world's biodiversity remains within Indigenous communities because of this decision-making system. The decision's already been made by the system. That's why those land bases are healthier. That's why you have way more biodiversity, even more so than in protected areas, state protected areas like national parks, for example. So my question here is, well, how do we, if we understand this, how do we resolve that, right? And that's the big challenge. It takes lots of work, but I think one of the main points of this is like really exploring some of those fundamental assumptions we're all bringing to these relationships. Next slide. This is just an example, I'm running out of time, but where it's just trying to pull, everyone's trying to pull information, right? If you're going into an engagement and you represent an agency, a nonprofit, a university, it's like, oh, you know, like I said, we want to take this TEK and we want to sort of pull it into our systems. Well, I would just say, well, remember, when you do that, you're subjugating that knowledge, that highest level of law. And a lot of the work that we need to do to articulate that law hasn't been done yet within communities and needs to be done in order to be communicated effectively in a way that the other, i.e. non-Western, understands in ethical space. Next slide. This is a reiteration of a point I made a couple times, and we talked about community decision making, right? Really understanding some of those concepts that come out of Indigenous language, which are different from English, and taking that obligation as an Indigenous organization to bring forward those concepts, train non-Indigenous people on those concepts, and make them understand when they're in agreement that they're binding themselves to a different set of conceptual obligations. Next slide. So this is the last slide here. I just wanted to say, you know, if this framework provides generate any understanding, or you think you might want to reflect on it, like understand sort of where you are at within each of those structures. If you're on the Indigenous side or you're on the Western side, what are you able to do? How do you demonstrate in this sort of ethical space-based relationship this deeper understanding that you gain an understanding of the other, and that those assumptions you bring about how things fit within your particular society are really constantly drawn out in conversation. So I'll end with that. Thanks so much for taking your time to listen to me and James and be here with Rising Voices.
Thank you so much, Gwen, and to James. That was phenomenal. Getting a lot of comments in the chat of just folks are really inspired and motivated, and lots to reflect on and continue to learn from. We do have about 10 minutes for questions. I have a couple questions that did come in, and I'll raise those as they're coming in. If you want to put them in the chat, and you're welcome to raise your hand, we'll get to as many as possible. And also, I know there's been a number of questions about the recording being available. Yes, it might take just a few days to get it up and running, but we will be sharing out the recording with everyone on the Rising Voices listserv and everyone who registered for today. And so to start out the questions, we have one that came in, and Gwen, I think there's a little more for you, but also James, you touched on this a bit as well. The question is that you brought up law as story sounds like an amazing approach. Can you clarify that approach a bit?
Yeah, sure. So story as law is an amazing approach, and it's very conceptually simple, right? You have a story about an event or a relationship or a lesson that contains a lesson. And so part of the work that we've been doing is to work with actually lawyers who are trained in sort of how to draw out law from story. There's certain methods and protocols that many Indigenous nations are finding useful. There's a process of how you analyze that story. It's called a case brief, actually. Those of you who are lawyers are probably familiar, but it's applied to Indigenous story, taking a look at the facts, looking at the reasoning, coming out with the legal principles from those stories. And those are the legal principles explained in a way that people can understand them who aren't familiar with how to interpret or be interpreted to from Indigenous story. So that's part of the work that Indigenous nations are doing. So you not only have the story in its original context, you have the interpretation through your cultural teachers telling you the lesson for how to behave, but then you're also now developing this sort of codified, familiar looking legislative within the legislative parameters, which is really familiar to Western legal authorities and practitioners. So that's the work that's happening, you know. So and I would just say one of these things is like, once you have it in like that, where you have the reference to the story, you have the legal way that people can understand it. One of the things we're exploring now is like, there's this process where when you're going to change legislation in Canada, like you will need to do to establish a national park, they have a process called incorporation by reference of, say, provincial law. And so we're saying incorporate by reference Indigenous law, Indigenous story and legal principles within that process. So then our hope and plan is to have Indigenous legal concepts and stories embedded within the Canadian legislative framework, the National Park Act, stuff like that. So I'll stop.
You know, I would just comment. I think Gwen, you know this more than I do, but it's interesting, the Delgamuukw decision in Canada, and where it recognized oral history as valid and valid and something that I think, and I can't remember when that case was settled, or so to speak, when, but that was really important, right? Oral history is valid and it could be used in court law. So I'm wondering, maybe that's a question from me to you, Gwen, is that how do you think about the Delgamuukw decision in oral history and then this idea of story and law?
Yeah, I think that was 87, and that's a super important precedent for sure. It said not only is Indigenous law and oral words admissible in court in a colonial court system, right? But that we're all here to stay. So I think that was, you know, it's often referenced. And so, you know, over time, I talked about this notion of indigenization, right? Like over time, we'll all be speaking Lakota, or we'll all be speaking Cree, you know, depending on regionality. And so, but we're not there yet, right? And so, and a lot of people don't understand those oral traditions. Like Delgamuukw is a how many hundreds pages decision, right? About how you validate oral law, right? And so what's happening here is we're trying to not just say, okay, well, here we're just going to speak this law and then we're all going to abide by it. It's like, well, if we're going to indigenize, everyone needs to understand and come along with understanding this law. And as we're moving towards increased knowledge of Indigenous concepts, Indigenous law, and sort of collectively binding ourselves to those, we're obligated to take these steps of compromise by writing them in English and writing them down on paper and that kind of stuff. So that's what I think a little bit, but I know.
Thank you so much for sharing that, both of you. And another question that came up is asking, how should one follow up with tribal leaders after a reasonably successful event? So what is a good way to honor the efforts and continue building collaboration without a specific goal, but really just to relate together? For example, this person shared that an elder visited their class last term and they wanted to follow up with a thank you letter. So if you have any thoughts to share on this.
Well, and this is James. I would say that, well, I like that letter. I like the letter in particular with elders. I think that's a good protocol. Also, I think that, you know, one of the things that I think is an important value is this idea of reciprocity, and that to remind your institution, your school, about the importance of that engagement with the elder. And I do think that it's also important not to think of it as a one-off, kind of a one idea, but really to get the school involved in looking at other sort of opportunities to engage with not only the elder, but also the community where the elder comes from. And I think that what that tells me, and maybe what tells the tribal side of things, is that there is really a commitment for this relationship building aspect. And so I do think that that's important. And also I think it's good to learn more about the history of items and things that matter to that particular tribe or for that particular culture, and to respond with something that's appropriate as well. So gifts are good, letters are good, but also I think that recognition and honoring is also. And so if they have you have newsletters, or if you have things that that you share with the school or the community, I think that's also good, is to recognize the elder in those kind of good ways. And I think with permission, I think that's a good thing to do, just to, again, remind the community the importance of the elder and his contribution to your school.
Thank you so much, James, for sharing those reflections. We have, I know we're just about time here, a couple more questions I'm gonna try to get to. One, Gwen, if you're able to access the chat to everyone, if you have the link to the writings that you shared about the ethical space frameworks, a few folks asked about that. If you do have the links to share and can pop that into the chat. And then another question is, someone asked if, and this might be a little bit closer kind of to your region, James, but Gwen, definitely welcome you to chime in too. This person, they work for a nonprofit focused on ecological restoration in Longmont, Colorado, and are asking the best ways to start finding who to connect with locally to determine what opportunities they have to support Indigenous peoples in the Boulder Longmont area.
Oh, that's well, I mean, I think what I'm aware of, I mean, I think Julie, your center is another, the Rising Voices Center is good. I think it's a good resource to open up. I think this idea of right relationships is another organization that I'm familiar with in the Boulder area. I forget the names. Anita Palmer. Yeah, but I know that. But I know that they're online. They have a website. I know they have newsletters, and they have programs, activities. So I think it's Anita Palmer, but it's right relationships, something like that in the Boulder Longmont area. I also think that we do a lot of work with land acknowledgements now. Julie, you gave a land acknowledgement. I gave one. I don't know if Gwen gave one, but part of the challenge, I think, is that how do we build upon those land acknowledgements, and to the point where they don't become as hollow, but hollow in the sense that they're carrying something forward, something that's good. And so I think I always remind people that there's plenty of resources, plenty of books, and I think organizations like Rising Voices and others, the Right Relationship in Boulder, they're bringing tribal nations into Boulder, into Longmont. I think the Indigenous Day they have in the Boulder area is another one that you should be aware of. I mean, they bring tribal leaders from the Arapaho tribe in Wyoming to that place, and I think that's good. And I think just getting connected with those things will help you, again, get a better understanding of not only what's going on, but what role or contribution can you have to advance these relationships.
Thank you so much for that, James. And we've been popping some of the links into the chat as they're coming up, so if folks are able to see those. And I would love more than anything to continue this well into the day. I do want to respect James and Gwen's time and all of yours. This is definitely my favorite, most dear space to be in. And so I think that one of the questions that Gwen posed at the end, is really important, and I want to raise up again here, is really asking folks, how will you understand your work and future work within this? And Gwen, you brought up, where some of the truth and reconciliation work has emerged out of some of the work in South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and recognizing the work of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who often raised the idea of that it's upon us to come together and not be in this world of adaptation apartheid, but really unite together for a world of climate justice. And I appreciate all of you being here together and doing this hard work and good work together here and into the future. And we've had a very full event together and covered a lot of virtual ground today. We're so honored for each of your participation. About Rising Voices really is about the people who make it what it is. And so our heartfelt gratitude to James and Gwen for your time, for your shared knowledge and wisdom, and being here with us today and continuing that engagement. To Reed for leading our technology, and to all of you. And we look forward to our continued engagements together. So with that, everyone, please stay safe, stay well, and we hope to see you again here real soon. Take care.